In today's podcast, I have two special guests. First is AJ Warner. He's Chief Strategy Officer at Offchain Labs, the team behind Arbitrum. They're one of the leading scaling solutions using Optimistic Rollups. My second guest is Tegan Kline. She's a co-founder of Edge and Node, the initial team behind the Graph protocol. Tegan will help co-host the Defiant Podcast with me, so you can expect to see her in future episodes. We begin our conversation with an introduction to Offchain Labs from AJ.
First of all, thank you for having me on. And Tegan, I'm honored to be the first guest on your co-hosted show. We work closely together, so it's great to have this opportunity as well. So Offchain Labs and Arbitrum, a number of different, pieces. Like sometimes people get confused. Offchain Labs is the development arm, the company that's building the technology. So Arbitrum is the technology stack, the optimistic rollup solution that we've designed. We call it Arbitrum. So it's really the distinction between the company that is building and developing this protocol and right now stewarding the growth of the protocol, and Arbitrum being the underlying technology stack. For optimistic rollup technology, it's really quite simple to understand, and I'll try and break it down into the different core pieces. Ethereum by design does not scale on the base layer, what we call Ethereum layer 1. And the reason for that is the more throughput you have, the harder it would be to decentralize and to remain secure, because it would be much harder for people at home to run nodes. So Ethereum, and this is Vitalik's rollup-centric roadmap, is to have second layers, layer 2 technologies, rollup technologies, live on top of Ethereum and say, Ethereum, we're going to rely on you for decentralization and security purposes, but for execution, we're going to build other environments that live on top. So Arbitrum, I'm sure, your users who have used it, to everybody, it looks like a blockchain. It looks like a blockchain that lives on its own, like a standalone layer 1 blockchain. But under the hood, it's really a set of smart contracts that lives on top of Ethereum and that relies on Ethereum for certain components of its security. So when you do a transaction on Arbitrum, so what does it mean to be a rollup? So when you do a transaction on Arbitrum, all of these transactions are batched together. They're aggregated and they're posted to Ethereum layer 1. And we take and we compress the call data. And this is really where the cost savings comes from. Because when you do a transaction on Ethereum on layer 1, what you're telling the validator set is, I want you to A, store my data, but also B, use your computational resources to execute my transaction. And the execution of the transaction is much more consumptive than the cost of storing the transaction. So by moving to a layer 2 like Arbitrum, you're doing the execution in a different environment, which brings the cost savings down. And then when we compress the transactions, we bring the cost savings down more, and that gets posted to Ethereum. And that's the core principle of layer 2 technology. The part that sort of separates different rollups is, how do you prove to Ethereum layer 1, or how does Ethereum layer 1 know that what happened on layer 2 was true, correct, and complete? And that when I say I transferred money to Tegan, it's actually true. And when layer 1 knows that, they can adjudicate that. And that is where ZK rollup and optimistic rollup technologies differ, where ZK rollups use some very sophisticated math to provide a proof. And optimistic rollups, they say, what we'll do is, whoever validated and posted the transaction, for every batch that is posted, a 7-day window opens, which we call a challenge period, where anybody who's another validator can come ahead and say, this is actually not true, and I'm going to challenge what you've posted. And then there's an adjudication process to determine who is the winner. It's all deterministic, but we use this window where we post things optimistically in the intention and the hope that nobody should challenge. And the systems are designed that nobody would challenge maliciously, because they have to post a stake and they'll lose their money, and everything kind of functions that way. So that's the high level of how optimistic rollup technology works and what we're building in Offchain Labs.
Amazing. Yeah, it's been great to see the costs being lowered in terms of gas. And I know that that's really kind of the values that the Defiant was predicated on, and just lowering the barrier of entry when it comes to entering this space. Not many people know this, but you all started very early in crypto, back before Ethereum, when it was just Bitcoin. So tell us a little bit about that origin story.
Yeah, it's actually the origin story of Offchain Labs is super cool. So Ed Felton, who's our chief scientist and one of the co-founders, was a professor at Princeton. And people were just starting to really get into the notion of like smart contracts. And Ed was very early and perceptive to this and said, there's no way if we use blockchain technology that this can scale just using one layer. And in fall 2014 at Princeton, he did a class seminar on like, how do we scale blockchain technology using layer twos, these roll-up concepts on like a hypothetical technology, right? Like Ethereum didn't exist. It wasn't live. It was like, how do we have these platforms? So all of that was just theoretical at that time. And then Ed went to the White House. He was Obama's deputy CTO. And when he came back, Stephen and Harry, the other two co-founders, they came into his office. It was around the CryptoKitties congestion. Like that was like the first real time, if you remember, if your users remember, that the first real time there was congestion on the Ethereum chain. And obviously like a sign of things to come. And they said, we really got to pick up this concept of Arbitrum that you were developing 4 years ago in this class seminar that you did, or 3 years ago. And that turned into, continued research, a paper that was published, and the formation of the company, in 2018 at a time when people didn't really appreciate, like, what are we trying to scale? Like, we're still trying to figure out like what use cases look like. And the team, we were focused on scaling already at that time. And, even from that point in 2018, it was till 2020 that before a testnet existed and before really demand, DeFi Summer was probably the first, time that we saw sustained, demand on the Ethereum layer 1 for block space. And that really propelled, I think, the conversation about like layer 2 technologies, really into the forefront of if we're going to actually have mass adoption of this technology, this is going to be critical to solve. So
interesting that, you guys started even before Ethereum was live and just, had this very kind of just forward-looking take on how blockchains would develop, that eventually, block space would become scarce. And that, these layer 2s would be needed, like back in 2014. And then, realizing that this actually did start to happen with CryptoKitties in 2017. But then after that boom time, there was like 2 years of crypto winter. So what was it like, just building this highly technical project that was, meant to solve for high adoption and high usage when essentially nobody was using crypto?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think that it goes back to the same principles of, your vision and your goals for the space and your beliefs in the concepts of decentralization and what you want to contribute to grow that, right? And, like in 2014, there were no smart contract platforms. And like this was like a priority, that Ed was focusing on from a research perspective already. And in 2018, when basically nobody was using this and, even like the prices were deflating, investor interest was deflating. I think these are principles, both, first of all, from a technical perspective, like these are incredible problems to solve. And I think that's one of the things that drives our team is like constantly innovating and problem solving. And also being an environment of, this is fundamental technology that, we're looking to dedicate our time and our resources to and our research and, continuing to, it's not easy to build things like when there's no demand for product market fit. And like in 2018, obviously there wasn't, but the passion, I think, for being at the cutting edge from like a research perspective, I think that, especially the engineering side, will continue to get our team excited. And it gets our team excited today. And, we'll probably talk about it later, but like the Nitro upgrade that we had on Arbitrum about 2 months ago, the first repo, like the first commit for that was 6 days after we launched Arbitrum. Our team, somebody on our team, Lee, one of our tech leads, had like a new redesign that he's like, we can make Arbitrum so much more efficient and so much cheaper if we implemented this. And he literally started basically like 6 days after like a crazy sprint of no sleep, because that's just like the nature of like the team that we have, like that's developing Arbitrum. We're always trying, and scaling is a cat and mouse game, right? I'm sure right now Arbitrum is not at capacity. It's, not close to capacity. in 2 years, I'm confident it will be. And then we're going to be having these conversations about layer 3 technologies and the interactions between layer 2s and layer 3s and all of these different components. And, from a product perspective and a user experience perspective, like how do we solve these things? But like principally, like we're always going to be at the forefront of trying to improve scale, trying to improve innovation and efficiencies for users of these technologies. So I think that's always been the thing that's drove us and continues to drive us to try and make the technology we're building the best it can be.
I love that. So if you're thinking about building in the space, maybe the layer 3 space is where you should think about building.
That is going to be the new thing, yeah.
Yeah, right. I remember back in the day, sharding used to be all the rage. And, did your strategy for Arbitrum change along the way, or did you kind of have a solid understanding that rollups would be this preferred scaling solution?
So sharding's changed. So it used to be on like the Ethereum roadmap that sharding was both for data availability and for execution. And, also, again, in 2020, Vitalik's vision and the Ethereum community vision really pivoted to like a rollup-centric roadmap, where we're going to build for execution environments rollups and think about sharding and increased data availability on the layer 1. And I think it probably had like small modifications to our strategy. I think we knew that like execution sharding was like would have been way down the road anyways. But sharding is, it remains important. Now we're talking about like EIP 4844, which is going to make, use of rollups on Ethereum more effective and efficient. So I think that Ethereum's roadmap became easier for us to integrate with as like a technology stack when they pivoted to focusing more on a rollup centric roadmap. But I think principally the notion of, continuing to focus on scaling and sharding is critical because on the Arbitrum 1 rollup, the majority of cost and expense is still posting call data to layer 1. And that's because there's still congestion, even though it's much less than 6 months ago or 12 months ago, there is still congestion on layer 1. And having data availability sharding is going to be critical if we want to really have transactions that are inclusive to the entire world on Ethereum and solving scale without compromise on that.
Okay, so to kind of recap that a little bit, is the view that that sharding and rollups will be complementary down the line, with sharding kind of taking care of the storage part of things and rollups taking care of the execution part of things.
That's right. Yeah, I think we still are very much advocates and supportive of all the efforts that are being undertaken in order to have execution on layer 2 and sharding remaining critical for data availability purposes on layer 1.
Zengo is a non-custodial wallet that aims to solve private key vulnerabilities. They do this by using a type of cryptography called MPC. That's a technology that's been used by billion-dollar institutions. Zengo Wallet is fully recoverable and uses 3-factor authentication, including 3D biometrics, so no one can access your wallet but you. They also have 24/7 support with real people directly on their app. Keep your crypto and NFTs safe with tech the big institutions have used for years. Download the Zengo app from the App Store or Google Play, that's Zengo, and use code DEFIANT to get $20 back on your first purchase of $200 or more. Go to their site for details and terms and conditions. Aave's latest deployment, V3, was launched on 6 networks and introduces new features like isolation mode, efficiency mode, and portals. Explore the protocol at aave.com, and if you're building in the ecosystem, apply for a grant through aavegrants.org. According to L2Beat, Arbitrum has nearly $2.7 billion in total value locked, which makes it the top layer 2. AJ goes on to explain the dApps and protocols driving value and activity on Arbitrum.
We're very excited about the community's excitement and adoption of what we're doing. It really literally drives us every day. It's incredible going to conferences or, seeing people in the community, and they're just so excited about what we're doing, and they're part of the community, and they're along for the ride. And so thank you for that. I think the area of Arbitrum that has found the most product market fit is sophisticated DeFi products, which basically products that could never have existed on Ethereum layer 1. And what I mean by that is, options, perpetuals, like the gas costs of doing some of these things on layer 1, even these depressed markets, are just make the technology like not viable. We've seen projects like GMX have, a huge user base, Mycelium, a couple of others in that side. And, we've seen Dopex in the option space really take off as like layer 2 native projects, with most of the major Ethereum layer 1 DeFi projects joining the ecosystem as well as part of their multi-chain expansion and support. There are other projects, I think, that have benefited immensely too. So, for example, projects like, LivePeer that have joined that have, made it easier to decentralize certain services by distributing to providers in the ecosystem in a way that might not have been possible based on just transaction fees on layer 1. And some gaming ecosystems like Treasure that have high volume transactions that would have probably been less inclusive for their communities compared to being on layer 1. I think, particularly in the DeFi space, the reason I think for the success of Arbitrum is you have a community of people that are very focused on prioritization of security, right? So, throughout all of these different scaling solutions, whether they're sidechains or L1s, or L2s, there's trade-offs between scale, price, and security. I think the sweet spot of where Arbitrum is right now has been, especially in the DeFi world, very palatable. An Arbitrum transaction, like a typical derivatives transaction, is probably about 7 cents right now. On layer 1, it would be maybe $10. So they've seen a lot of on that trade-off perspective. They've seen a lot of growth, I think. And we can talk, if we want to talk about Arbitrum Nova later, we can see certain social community opportunities that have probably had less traction to date. And we're looking to address that. But I think DeFi has been the most successful from an onboarding perspective into layer 2s so far.
Can you double click a little bit into security? I know that with a layer 2, you can get the security of Ethereum without the high gas costs. Can you just double click into that?
Yeah, so it's really a function of the rollup technology and the ability, if there is ever something that you want to adjudicate for the layer 1, to be deterministic based on the outputs provided by the layer 2. So it's really like the rollup architecture and infrastructure. The trust assumptions of Arbitrum are, as long as there's one validator that is honest, right, then you can have those properties. And we can talk about sort of the roadmap of Arbitrum and being in the mainnet beta period right now. But the ultimate goal of how these technologies mature are extremely decentralizable and allow you to rely on the infrastructure and security provided by the Ethereum ecosystem, obviously much more effectively than, an alternative layer 1 or a sidechain, which might have their base layer much less decentralized.
And then I wanted to double click on why you think DeFi has found more of a fit with Arbitrum than social applications.
Yeah, so the reason for that is, I think, when you have social applications, their trade-offs are different. And people weren't when I talk to a DeFi project, the gas fees aren't something that they can't handle, right? 10 cents for their users, slippage is important, right? The size of the trade, the security, right? But if we're talking about expanding communities or very high throughput NFTs or social opportunities, they have a trade-off and more sensitivity to gas, right? So something that might be a 10-cent transaction might become, make the use case that they're trying to implement completely impossible. And that's actually the reason why we launched the Nova chain. And we can talk about that for a minute. Arbitrum Nova is intended to solve that, right? We're building a chain for social and gaming purposes. And the reason for that is like I mentioned earlier, when we were talking to gaming projects or social, community projects, they were saying, we would love to launch within the Ethereum ecosystem. We would love to launch on Arbitrum, but leveraging Ethereum layer 1 security, even using Arbitrum, is still too expensive for our use case. And that goes back to the conversation we were having before of hopefully this all gets solved with sharding for data availability on layer 1. But today in 2022, it's not live. And the trade-offs are real. And what ultimately was happening was people were leaving the Ethereum ecosystem, both layer 1 and layer 2, for alternative environments that provide lower cost transactions, EVM compatible, but obviously not leveraging the Ethereum security. so that's what we launched Nova. And the Nova chain and the Arbitrum one, we'll do the nomenclature for a second because it can get complicated. Both of these products, Arbitrum 1, which is the rollup, and Arbitrum Nova, which is the AnyTrust technology chain, they both rely on the same Nitro code base. Nitro is like the technology software. The only difference between these two chains and why Nova is significantly cheaper is where are you posting call data? On Arbitrum 1, you're posting call data to Ethereum, like a true rollup. On Arbitrum Nova, you're posting call data to a data availability committee. And the security properties are slightly different. And that is the reason for why it's so much cheaper, because the cost of posting to a committee is much cheaper than the cost of posting to Ethereum. And this committee that stores the data and the security properties are, as long as one committee member is willing to provide you your data, you can have the confidence that your data will exist. Everything else continues to happen on Ethereum. Validator assertions, the tech stack is built on top of Ethereum. It's really just a question of where you post the data. At launch, we launched about 2 months ago with Reddit. At launch, the data availability committee included Arbitrum, Offchain Labs, Reddit, FTX, Consensus, QuickNode, Lido, and a couple of others, and we're continuing to grow and expand what that committee looks like, with the goal being that anybody can get comfortable. They only have to trust one member of the committee, and the reason for that is the validator set, if there's some sort of collusion attack, can always force the protocol back into rollup mode. And what I mean by that, and that is one of the biggest differences between Arbitrum Nova and like a side chain, which has like a validator set or its own committee, is the ability for the chain to force itself back into rollup mode. So if there's ever an attack, the chain doesn't halt. The progress is not stopped because like a 2/3 validator attack. As long as one validator remains honest, the chain just falls back into rollup mode. And the effect of that is that it'll become more expensive and it'll become like the same price as using Arbitrum 1. But you don't halt progress. You don't have the ability to censor the chain. So those are the high level differences. We're working with Reddit, and Reddit chose to launch on the Arbitrum Nova chain because of these cost differences for their use case. To put it into perspective, when Reddit launched their first 2 community points initiatives, and we can talk in more detail about what their program looked like, they onboarded about 260,000 wallets on day 1. And the cost of like seeding all of these wallets with the Reddit ERC20s, I think it was somewhere in the range of like $1,400 to $1,500. If that happened on Ethereum, it would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it would have been a gas war. And if it happened on Arbitrum 1, the rollup, it probably would have cost tens of thousands. So I think that's a good example of like, depending on the use case, depending on what you're trying to do, you have to be practical of the trade-offs. And what we were seeing in the social and gaming spheres was that the trade-offs were pushing a lot of projects to leave Ethereum because they just couldn't justify the transaction fees for their use cases.
Yeah, I know that some people within the ETH community were a little bit disappointed by the committee piece. Can you maybe speak to some individuals that are listening that might have that position?
Yeah, so for the most part, we didn't get too much pushback. I think there are other environments that have like very similar structures, like Immutable X relies on a committee using Starkware technology. So it is stuff that it's not like we innovated on. I think a lot of teams are looking at adding alternative data availability committee sets as part of like this new modular blockchain infrastructure. I think that what I would tell people who are critical about this concept is we are not pushing projects to launch on Nova that we think makes sense and justify the security of using Arbitrum 1. What I mean by that is I'm not telling GMX, let's say the leading project in Arbitrum 1, pick up and move to Nova to get cheaper gas fees, right? What I'm telling projects are, we've heard you loud and clear, and you've told us that the trade-offs for you are either we leave the Ethereum ecosystem for less decentralized, less secure technologies that it can offer the affordances and transaction fees that we want, or we can't launch on Ethereum. And we're trying to offer a product that we think is, from a security perspective and a decentralization perspective, significantly superior to a typical sidechain, and has the same cost structure and pricing versus like a rollup. So if we're talking about a world in which Ethereum's data availability sharding is already implemented, the need for this kind of, technologies becomes more limited. And right, maybe we get to a world where Arbitrum Nova technology, migrates to posting its call data on Ethereum. But if we're trying to satisfy and be inclusive to all use cases, all types, and frankly, even people from all over the world, right? So for some places in the world, a 10-cent transaction is very expensive as a transaction fee. And for some places, if you're in the United States, it's probably palatable depending on what you're doing. But if we want to be inclusive to underdeveloped countries, if we want to be inclusive to other use cases, right now we're in an environment where we need to have a suite of offerings that can resonate.
Staying on the topic of potential risks in Arbitrum. So I mentioned L2B with their TVL metrics, and they also highlight different potential risks on Arbitrum. So kind of the two critical risks are the fact that validators are apparently not fully permissionless at the moment, that they need to be whitelisted. So that does create some level of kind of centralization, and that there is no delay in code upgrades, which means potentially somebody could, upgrade the code in a malicious way to steal funds or, do something to hurt other users, and it doesn't give the rest of the users much recourse in that case. So would love for you to either, clarify or address these concerns.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this is not something we're hiding. If you look at the Arbitrum bridge page or Arbiscan, which is our explorer, at the top we have a banner on every page that's user facing saying, Arbitrum is still in mainnet beta. It has administrative controls, with sort of describing both with a link to the L2B page, which is a great third party resource, and we applaud them for the work that they're doing in monitoring this, and it also our status. And I think that it's important to think about the trade-offs here. This is, just as we described earlier, the how long it's taken to develop this. This is extremely sophisticated and complex technology. And everything that we decide is a trade-off between bug risk and malicious actor risk. And you have to make, I wouldn't say compromises, but I think it's an iterative process of getting to full decentralization and decentralized control of these things, where you have confidence that certain risks are outweighed by other risks. And the technology is still very much, it's fully feature complete. The whole protocol has been implemented, all the proofs have been implemented. There is nothing that we are hiding from the perspective of what is deployed. Arbitrum is a feature complete protocol, but it's sophisticated technology that, hasn't been around for an extremely long time. And we are always grappling with that trade-off. So we will not remove the mainnet beta moniker until we feel confident in the decentralization of what we're doing, where we don't have the ability to focus on these things ourselves and have these administrative controls live in our hands. But we're constantly grappling with the trade-offs between, software risk from a bug perspective and malicious actor risk. And that's where we're at now, but we're extremely transparent about it. And, we continue to iterate and improve on areas of decentralization where we can.
Yeah, decentralization is definitely a journey. The other major optimistic rollup is optimism. What makes Arbitrum different than Optimism? And then can you speak to any other optimistic rollups that you think might have a unique or exceptional approach that are different than Arbitrum?
So obviously, very familiar with the Optimism team and what they're doing. I would say if we had this conversation a year ago, I would say that there were very significant distinctions in our technical infrastructure. We pioneered something called interactive fraud proofs, which is basically a bisection challenge game. They had something called single round fraud proofs. They've pivoted about a year ago now to developing also using interactive fraud proofs. So the technology stacks are starting to converge a little bit more. I'll say that I'll talk about us for a second more. I think one thing we're proud of is that Arbitrum is feature complete. We've fully built out the protocol. We've championed a lot of research in this space, and it's great to see different teams continuing to push the envelope on what the technology can look like. yeah, but it's great to have diversity of teams working to solve these problems. In terms of other optimistic rollup teams, I'm less familiar with them. I know Fuel Labs was one of the earliest ones on payments years ago, and they're working on the V2 now. But I'm less familiar with that infrastructure. But obviously, there's many ZK rollup teams as well that are looking to help scale Ethereum too.
Absolutely. And on that topic, zero knowledge rollups are part of Ethereum's ecosystem scaling strategy. So what are the trade-offs between ZK rollups and your Arbitrum optimistic approach?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's worth flagging, and Steven on our team loves to talk about this, is that we're the only major sort of scale rollup team that doesn't have a nod to the underlying technology in their name. So you have like Optimism and Starkware and ZK Sync that all like very explicitly flag for you like what the technology is that they're building. And I think the reason for not the reason, but one thing that highlights our approach is we are looking to scale Ethereum. We are not looking to scale Ethereum with a specific technology in mind, right? We are very open-minded, and whatever the best technology was a year ago when we launched Arbitrum is already antiquated, right? With like the Nitro upgrade we had was an order of magnitude better, and our competitors have built stuff that are also significantly improving. And whatever looks the best now will not look the best in 3 years. And roll-up technology and scaling technology will all continue to innovate. And that's the approach that we have and the mindset we have. Today, if you're building a general smart contract platform, the most advanced technology, if you want to especially have EVM equivalence or EVM compatibility, is optimistic rollup technology. The ZK teams that are focusing on general smart contract platforms, the proving costs are quite expensive. There's compatibility concerns with what you can do, and frankly, none of them, other than Starknet in its alpha, are live yet. So if we have the mindset of we want to solve scale today, and the problem exists today, we always have to focus on what is the best technology of the day while continuing to research and innovate and develop what might be the best technology in 3 years from now. If there is efficiency improvements from a ZK technology standpoint, if the EVM compatibility can remain the same, if the ability to add other languages and support can remain the same, all of these things are interesting to us, and we will innovate and we will continue to innovate. But we firmly believe that, as we said in October 2022, the most, obvious path for scale today is optimistic rollup technology. And that's why we've chosen to implement it. We know we're trying to scale. We're not trying to scale with a specific tool or specific resource. And that's really our approach. We put out a blog post that I can share with you in December of last year, why we chose optimistic rollup technology. And it highlights a lot of these points where, the proving costs are expensive, compatibility is a challenge. And if we're trying to use technology that will be great in 5 years, we don't know what it's going to be in 5 years, right? Like the research breakthroughs that will happen, the innovation that will happen, make it extremely hard to determine today what that looks like. And we will just continue to be at the forefront of trying to, always innovate for our community and improve the technology where we can.
Web3 is weighed down by fragmented experiences, becoming more of an obstacle for users rather than a warm invitation. Core seeks to erase these points of friction. Built by the team behind Avalanche, Core is an all-in-one command center for Web3, supporting Avalanche, Ethereum, and Bitcoin, a rich ecosystem of dApps, Bitcoin and Ethereum bridges, NFTs, subnets, and more. Download the Core browser extension to get started, and connect to the Core web to unlock additional features at core.app. As opposed to other scaling solutions, Arbitrum is one of the few that doesn't nod to the underlying technology it uses in its name. As AJ mentioned, their goal is to scale Ethereum without being a proponent of any specific scaling technology. Does this mean Arbitrum will have a ZK component in the future?
It's a good question. I'm not the best personally on the team to answer that. The one thing I would say is we have no immediate plans of changing to ZK. The ZK teams are making great breakthroughs, and there's been a ton of excitement and noise around ZK, which is great. We don't have any immediate plans to change to ZK, but we also have top tier researchers who have an understanding of ZK technology, understanding of how to scale these systems. I wouldn't say that like we have a plan to incorporate ZK. There could be a new thing that like nobody has heard of in 2022, where in 2024 that will be like the new ZK, and like maybe that is the thing we will incorporate, right? The commitment that we will make is we will always try and be at the forefront of scale and using the resources that are necessary to scale, without a bias to necessarily a specific resource. Like, Steven, our CEO, was like, did his PhD in cryptography. If you looked at his background, you'd think he'd be a ZK maxi, right? But he's being practical. And in 2018, when they were starting to design Arbitrum, in 2020 and 2022, it was still obvious that, ZK technology is not, from a maturity perspective, there to match what an optimistic rollup, could offer. And that might change. And I think there's a ton of breakthroughs, which is amazing. But there's no guarantee that that will be the case, and we're just going to continue to always, remain at the forefront.
I appreciate the pragmatic approach, and many don't know that Arbitrum has this separate gaming and social focused chain with Nova. Can you chat a little bit about the future that you see there? Some people say the future is, one app per chain. Do you see it as more of a use case per chain?
So it's interesting, right? Like we talked a little bit earlier about like the layer 3s, and we've seen a lot of conversation both internally and with projects about the trade-offs of being on a public chain and versus being on a private chain. And I think that there are trade-offs, and people love the glamour of I have my own chain and it's great, but they also don't necessarily think about what does that mean? Like, for example, like, do I have support from the graph, right? Like, as Tegan knows, like the graph can't support, hundreds of thousands of application-specific chains without, hiring an army, and Oracle support or blockchain explorers, right? Are you using, Etherscan, which is like the everybody's favorite Explorer UI, but they won't be able to launch support for like hundreds of thousands of app chains, right? So thinking about the trade-offs between what does your use case need, right? Because there are benefits. You can have much closer parameterization around a chain. And I think the trade-offs between application-specific chains and use of public chains will continue to evolve as protocols and projects get product market fit. And what I think, and my personal opinion on this, is we're still at a stage where there's so much discovery. It's very hard, I think, for a project that launches on their own chain to attract users. I think a migration strategy is just much more logical. You start on a public chain, you build up a user base where you now have consumption that justifies, and you can attract infrastructure partners that you need, and you can build an ecosystem around what you're doing, a framework that can succeed. And I think that will probably be the playbook of what we see as we continue to scale. But today, I think there are very few use cases today that justify their own chain when you consider the trade-offs of the lack of composability and collaboration and infrastructure and tooling that you can have on a public chain, right? Like Arbitrum 1, which is our core rollup chain, almost every major centralized exchange supports direct onboarding, like key infrastructure like the Graph and Chainlink and Etherscan, Alchemy and Infura, and they all support it. And it's complex to have that level of user onboarding experience or developer onboarding experience and have compatibility if you're in an application specific environment. So I think that these things will continue to evolve, but that's just my personal take on it, not company opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it would be beautiful if we can get to a place where you can do integrations permissionlessly so that anyone, if you have an app-specific chain, you can add Chainlink, you can add the Graph, but we're definitely not there yet as an industry. I want to shift gears a little bit because I know everyone is burning to talk about your recent acquisitions and partnerships. So recently, you all acquired Prismatic Labs. They're core developers of one of the ETH2 clients. And there was a little bit of controversy about this in the community. So what drove the decision, and what do you all hope comes out of this acquisition?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think that like some of the controversy and people that had raised concerns might have also not been unbiased actors. Like some of them are part of competing layer 2 scaling teams, which obviously is a component of it. But they do raise philosophical questions that I think are important to answer, right? So I think the question objectively is a good question and an important thing to address. There's a couple of things with how we've worked with the Prismatic Labs team and how we've structured this that I think are critical. One is that, you know, we have a commitment for Prism to always remain open source and community agnostic. And that is never going to change. And the Offchain Labs team and the Prism team have both made that commitment. And, you know, if anybody knows, you know, the Prism team, unless they had absolute confidence in that being the case, I don't think they ever would have agreed to join, right? Like that is in nobody's interest. I think everybody is extremely aligned on the Ethereum Layer 1 consensus technology to remain open source, permissionless for anybody to use and supportive. And one of the benefits for that technology of joining Offchain Labs is it will have the resources to continue to grow and to continue to scale. Raul and Preston, who are the founders of Prismatic Labs, you know, no longer have the overhead and bloat of thinking about where do we apply for a grant or how do we sort of continue to hire and manage this. We have obviously a larger team, you know, both from an operations, HR perspective, you know, ways to get funding, that the project is in a better place to succeed with that commitment that it will remain open source, permissionless for anybody to use without modification. So on the consensus layer side, and that's one of the nice things, you know, like we have diversity of clients, right? The software is open source, and, you know, even if you don't trust us to be true, like these things remain correct. And that's one of the beauties of Ethereum and why decentralized technologies are important. In terms of like what we hope to get out of this, you know, I think after the merge, one of the biggest, a lot of the Ethereum Layer 1 focus is moving to improving the experience for Layer 2. So we have like EIP 4844, sharding, etc. All of these things that are intended to focus on scale, right? Ethereum before this was very focused on the migration from a proof of work environment to a proof of stake environment. But now a lot of like both the Layer 1 and Layer 2 work is focusing on scaling, and whether that is data availability scaling or execution scaling and rollups, like that is the critical thing that we are all focusing on now. And having, you know, a leading Layer 2 team and a leading Layer 1 team be able to work together to collaborate to effectively, you know, push the ball forward for the ecosystem is really what we're hoping to get out of, like, you know, being able to work. And we've already seen that they've been on our team for 2 weeks, but like these collaborative conversations, you know, it's just going to move the ecosystem. It's going to push both the Layer 2 technology, obviously Arbitrum, and the Layer 1 landscape of understanding how does Ethereum scale. Like there's nobody who has a better knowledge of like the Layer 1 technology stack than the Prismatic Labs team, and it's really exciting to be able to combine that with our knowledge base to just, you know, effectively work together to continue to collaborate and push the ecosystem forward. So we're extremely excited about this. I think it's extremely beneficial for the growth and scaling of Ethereum. But in terms of, you know, answering the questions like around, you know, centralization risk, it's not, I don't think it's something that the community should be concerned about. But even if they were, you know, that's first of all, that's why we have diversity of clients, which is great. But the software will continue to remain open source.
I think it's interesting if you like look at this acquisition from like a traditional business perspective. It looks like this kind of vertical integration, right, along along the Ethereum stack. So it's like the strategic decision to just like better align like the base layer of Ethereum with Layer 2, so that like the decisions you both make are able to just, you know, strengthen each other going forward.
Yes, I think it's a vertical integration of knowledge, right? It's, you know, our team has obviously been extremely focused on scaling, and that's what we've been doing for years and years. And their team has been extremely focused on the Layer 1, you know, consensus client. And bringing all of that under one roof is just going to have a lot of efficiencies. It's an incredible team of like high quality people who are dedicated to like everybody here is extremely Ethereum aligned, right? Like our team has, you know, given their professional careers, you know, to scaling Ethereum. Their team has given their professional careers, you know, to working on Ethereum Layer 1 from a consensus perspective. And having these teams and groups of individuals come together to just be able to like vertically scale the knowledge component I think is going to see incredible productivity increases.
Shifting gears a little bit to Reddit. So I recently saw that the Reddit NFT wallets hit close to 3 million. I know that's happening on Polygon, but it's really exciting to see the masses onboarding into the Web3 and NFT community. Can you talk a little bit about what Reddit is doing with Arbitrum with the points system? And do you foresee the NFT piece moving to Arbitrum Nova?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very exciting. I think Reddit's done an incredible job for like a Web2 focused team. To think about like the onboarding experience for people who are not crypto native into Web3. The Reddit wallet's been super cool. On the community point side, this goes back to, their 2020, they had the scaling bake-off. I'm sure some of you, users have tracked that. They put out a request for proposals of, how do we, this is our vision for scaling scaling communities. How do we do this in a way that can scale and be cost a reasonable amount of money? It took about 2 years to go from that point to them going live, a little more than 2 years. They spent 10 months. They spent 10 months basically diligencing different projects. And then they finally announced that they chose Arbitrum. They designed the product on testnet for a year. The principles that they chose for when they announced they chose Arbitrum were Ethereum alignment, decentralization, ability to decentralize the protocol, composability, EVM compatibility, all these different components that are important for developers at large. And they launched the first 2 communities in August on the Arbitrum Nova chain, which has been super exciting. The first 2 subreddits that are looking to decentralize, or when I say decentralize, I mean give community points to. So instead of like you get karma on Reddit, you can get an ERC20 representation of your contributions to these communities. They use the cryptocurrency subreddit and the Fortnite subreddits. So it's a really cool place to start. I think they're going to continue to grow it. Where this goes is going to be interesting. I think that it's an open white space of what it means to have social media communities controlled by communities in a way that we really haven't had before, right? It's like, imagine if crypto Twitter was like sort of separated from Twitter and had its own decision-making powers. It would be, a fascinating experiment. I think it's extremely early stages to see where it goes. I think it's extremely exciting to see what they're doing and the scale that they're doing it at. It was super cool to see the success that their Polygon implementation had on the NFT implementation on Polygon had. That went live before Arbitrum Nova was launched, and it's a different team. But I don't want to speak to their plans and like what their future vision is for migrating or keeping the NFT component of their ecosystem, but it's been really great to work with their team and see like the vision of what it means to scale communities. And we're super excited to work with them on Arbitrum for that.
Yeah, and for those that are more business-minded listening, can you talk a little bit about how you landed Reddit as a partner and how those negotiations went?
Yeah, so that one was actually probably less driven by like business considerations. They were extremely focused on technology. Technology was very important for them. It was all about technology diligence, and not just like technology today, but like the scale of like how does this technology mature into something? What does the end game for a specific technology look like? What does the end game for an ecosystem look like from a security and decentralization perspective? I think that was very important to them in their decision-making process. From a BD perspective, obviously, making sure that they're integrated into the ecosystem to the extent they wanted to, working with them. It's probably more, to be honest, it's probably more product help than they did a lot of their work in stealth around the launch. They were very public around the requests for proposals of chains, but very private about the product launch. But I think this was one of those deals that was very tech driven from a decision making from their team.
Fair enough. And then AJ, I think that you're one of the best at strategy and business development in the crypto space. What would you say is your secret to, successful strategy and successful BD?
Well, first of all, thank you. Humbling to hear that from you, especially. But I think one of the things that I like to say is there is an extreme focus in this space on collaboration and alignment. And sometimes that takes the form of, grants. But I think that one thing that we've done is spending our time to actually understand projects using our technology's business, who they can benefit from collaborating with, how we can be a helpful partner, and really investing ourselves into like what their success looks like, how we think about success, how we think about growth, from their mindset, not just from our perspective. And I think that is one of the things about Web3 that I love the most, where when a project is like building on Arbitrum, right? Like, in the Web2 context, like the equivalent would be, choosing to launch your website on like AWS versus like Google Cloud, right? And there really isn't, and like these ecosystems might those partners might like help you from like a setup perspective or cost optimizations, but they don't necessarily invest themselves, in your business. And because like that's just not how these things align and how these things are designed. With what we do, and what I love the most is every day I have conversations with teams like, well, actually, like I would, and like it's often unsolicited and maybe rude. I'm like, I would do this differently. Like this should be like your go-to-market strategy, right? And like this is how you should be talking to. Like let me set you up with that, and just like constantly trying to understand the business of who you're working with and how they can succeed. I think that's one thing that we've prioritized and focused on, is trying to like really collaborate with our partners.
Yeah, I think this collaborative nature of crypto is something that kind of you see across the board. Like I keep hearing the same kind of comment, speaking with founders. And it's like, yes, of course, you have competitors, but it's so early that at least for now, it seems like everyone is like mostly just trying to make the pie bigger rather than take the bigger piece for themselves. This episode is also brought to you by Circle, the sole issuer of USDC. USDC is always redeemable 1-to-1 for US dollars, has over 45 billion in circulation as of October 13th, and lets users easily access both TradFi and crypto financial services. Check out circle.com/transparency to see USDC's weekly reserve breakdowns and monthly attestation reports, and find out why USDC is a trusted stablecoin. Considering the growing rivalries among Layer 2s, does AJ think the L2 space is getting crowded? Also, what does he think about the relationship between the projects? Is there any noticeable hostility between competitors?
It's a good question. I think that I would say there's a lot of competition, and I think our relationships with some teams are super strong. Our relationships with other teams are less strong, right? And I think that's healthy. It's okay. It's natural. I would say that one thing that I think is interesting, despite, let's say, some competition, between these teams, is I don't think anybody questions anybody else's passion, vision, and ultimate goal, right? I think we all recognize the passion and sincerity of what we're all trying to do, which is scale Ethereum, scale decentralized technology, scale blockchain technology. And you have an incredibly brilliant set of people on different teams that are extremely passionate about their approach to doing it and the trade-offs that come with it. And for some of these people, have literally dedicated their lives, even, and compromised, personal lives in order to try and achieve this goal. And I think all of that manifests itself in this environment of competition, because we're all trying to achieve something that is such a significant thing, right? Like if we don't figure out scale, it is very hard to see like how this technology continues to mature and continues to onboard into 1 billion people. It's not a non-trivial thing that we're trying to solve. It's really like, my personal belief, and I'm sure, a lot of your users and yours as well, I'm not going to speak for you, but this is an incredibly important thing if we want to reshape the way, the world is organized and structured and incentivized to interact. And I think some ways that the combination of like the passion that people have, the scale of what we're, no pun intended, of what we're trying to accomplish, probably leads itself out. And also like it is competitive, right? If you have these conversations where, there's, if it's Web2 companies or major DeFi protocols that are trying to like position themselves on specific chains or ecosystems or platforms. It's competitive. And I think that the thing that I like about it, even though, it is competitive, is that I think nobody believes that the other side is malicious or the other project is malicious. Everyone's just trying to, do what's best and try their best. And I think though, even though, you do see some collaboration, like we were talking about earlier, like I think this level of competition is like a function of like the open nature of the community. Like you wouldn't see this competition in like other industries because it's just behind closed doors maybe. And I think a combination of like the nature of the industry, the passion, the scale of the problem, I think that's what's bringing it out. But, I have a lot of friends who are on other, teams that are trying to scale Ethereum, and, we get along. We get along great. It's just, it's part of it.
Yeah. In the end, everyone's, after the same goal. And if you're in this space, you're probably, believe in more or less free markets, right? And so you need to believe that competition is ultimately a good thing. So, and then to start wrapping up, would love to hear kind of what's next, like especially just like immediately next on the Arbitrum roadmap. Like what should we expect coming up? And of course, I'm going to have to ask this. Everyone in crypto is probably wondering when token. So is that something that's in the works?
No comment on the token side from me today. So I'm sorry, I'm going to decline on that one. In terms of what's next, I think that we just had the Nitro upgrade. We just had the Prismatic merge after the merge. And the Nova Chain launch. I think, our team is like, after those three big events, like, in somewhat regrouping, but also pushing forward. I think we're looking at how do we right now, like the big, like 0 to 1 step we've had, which was exciting, was the technology is in a very mature place now compared to where it's been. And now we are moving towards answering questions of how do we continue to make the developer experience better? How do we continue to focus on onboarding new people? How do we enter new verticals? How do we enter new geographies? How do we get exposure to, new underdeveloped countries or ecosystems or environments that we maybe haven't had the ability to, either from a technical or even more so from a non-technical perspective, have the ability to prioritize? And I think that's where we're going to be. You're going to see a lot more efforts now that are focusing both on the technical and non-technical side. So like, developer relations, programming support, all of this kind of stuff will continue to grow. And in terms of like our efforts as a team, continuing to expand and onboard and evangelize and educate people to join both Arbitrum and the Ethereum ecosystems. There's some technical work that we're doing, focusing on, sequencer stuff and all these different, things that our team is looking to continue to improve on. But that's the immediate next steps. And we're very excited. We're very excited to see where all of this takes us.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, so are we. And this has been a great conversation. Really learned a lot about Arbitrum and just, scaling Ethereum. And I think I'm going to put both of you on the spot. But as always, I want to finish the episode with learning what makes you defiant, and would love to also hear what makes my new co-host Tegan defiant. So AJ, maybe we can start with you and then finish up with Tegan.
So when you say defiant, give me what do you there's that can go in a lot of different directions. So what do you want me to focus on?
No, just anything about your experience or your personality, or maybe you don't think you're
okay.
Defiant.
No, I think I am. I think I just have in a lot of different things. I think that the thing that has always been something that I've cared a lot about is like the line between like paternalism and like guidance in life, and how systems that we've grown up in have been almost predatory in like how they've shaped our lives. And like, this is obviously a very common conversation with like, you know, the role of the SEC in regulating innovation, right? But even from like, you know, one of the things that I've never understood, and I remember in like high school asking my parents about this, and because I was looking at getting like my first credit card, and it was like the government lets, you know, credit card companies have like huge interest rates on these credit cards, but they tell you that, like, you know, you have to make contributions to like your 401k or do this or do that. And I think that some of these things are correct, right? But like the way that sovereignty has been shaped to fit a specific mold for an individual, I think is something that is that matters a lot to me. And you see this throughout society where, like, for example, if you look at like the history, in another world, I used to be a real estate lawyer, like before I really joined the ecosystem full time. And if you look at sort of discrimination or policies that are structurally designed for certain people in, like, you know, the residential mortgage world, right? Like there's a specific set of, you know, guidelines and guidance that shape how these policies are driven. And it's like, if you have a nice white collar job that is, you know, comfortable in pay, you know, you are going to be in a better position than if you make the same amount of money and you're like, you know, an actor or like a, you know, you're a 1099 contractor. And it's just, the world has structurally been designed to define people or things in certain ways. And I think that that is something that's always bothered me. And I think it's one of the things that attracts me to this space is our ability to objectively say, I don't care who you are, what you are. What I care is like the objective facts of how I can define, you know, your role, your contributions, your rights, and the ability to strip away, like, you know, systems that are designed structurally to maybe be unfair or more fair, because in open systems, somebody can always design things that are considered fair, right? And, you know, we will be naturally aligned to those environments. And I think that's something, like, I don't know if it makes you defiant, but I think it makes me super passionate about this space. It's amazing when, like, you know, you have, like in my role, like a conversation with somebody who's anonymous on Twitter, and then you get on like a video camera with them, like they're like 14 years old in high school and like just super passionate about coding and are trying something. And like that doesn't happen in other industries, and it doesn't happen in other frameworks where, you know, your university degree is the thing that's prioritized, or, you know, where part of the world you grew up in is the thing that's prioritized. And I think the ability to shatter those preconceived notions that structurally exist in societies is one of the things that, you know, I guess makes me defiant.
I love it. Yeah. It's exciting to be in this space where like we're building everything from the ground up, and kind of the old ways and kind of credentials aren't as meaningful anymore. Okay, now Tegan.
Yeah, I would define defiance or defiant as kind of open resistance or bold disobedience, right? So we are in a time right now where the monetary system is failing us. Inflation is insanely high here in the United States, and then we've seen inflation skyrocket across many countries around the world. Where we have this looming recession, this globalism rug pull. And so, you know, it's a crazy time right now. And I think in addition to that, you have these tech giants and social media companies that make us the product. It's extremely extractive. You know, even though we're going mainstream with NFTs, crypto is still a counterculture movement. And we're kind of fed up with the current system and the extraction. And so what we're building in Web3 and crypto is kind of the light at the end of this dark tunnel that's seemingly getting darker and darker. You know, and all the problems in the world, I believe, boil down to incentives and coordination. And so with crypto and Web3, we're fixing the incentives and we're coordinating at a global level without the need for governments or companies, which is extremely powerful.
I love it. Defying the old ways, defying authorities. And we need scale to do all of that. So again, AJ,
this is true.
Thanks so much for coming on the Defiant podcast. This was great. And Tegan, it was a pleasure co-hosting with you.
Thank you so much. Super excited. Thank you, AJ.